Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about how speaker knowledge modulates social learning across development. So this is about the process by which children learn from the language they hear from other people, and how that process is affected by the knowledge and cultural standing of the person who is speaking. I'm going to do this in the context of what children learn from generic language. So some of you heard me give a talk this morning in the pre-conference workshop. That was about generic representations in thought. I'm now doing something slightly different, so I just wanted to acknowledge it explicitly. That is about the interpretation of generic expressions in language. So that's going to be the focus of my talk today. So generic expressions in language are a very common way, perhaps the most common way, that we discuss categories, and especially social categories, with one another and with young children. Generics are expressions that refer to categories as abstract wholes instead of individuals or subsets, so they include things like girls wear pink, Canadians like hockey, a boy doesn't cry, women are nurturing, Jews celebrate Passover, babies take naps, and so on. So all of these things we often accept as true without thinking about them too much, which is interesting from a linguistics perspective, because of course these things don't mean all of the members of these categories do these things. We accept a lot of exceptions and can still think that a generic is true. Generics are also interesting linguistically and cognitively because our, as adults, and especially young children's interpretation of generics often extends far beyond the content of the expression that they hear. So really briefly, children's interpretation of generics often goes beyond the features that are described in the sentence. So beyond things like taking naps or celebrating Passover, they infer that those mentioned, when they hear those types of features described with generics, people often infer that they're prevalent, more prevalent than is, sometimes more prevalent than is supported by statistical evidence. People assume they're intrinsically caused even when they're not. They could be caused by cultural practice or norms or so on, but people tend to assume that the features described by generics, and again, especially young children, have a biological basis. People treat these claims as normative, not just descriptive, and restrictive. So even though there's nothing in a statement like Canadians like hockey that implies they don't like other types of sports as well, or that no one else likes hockey, people often interpret those sentences as implying that at least a little bit. Even more interestingly, the children and adults' interpretation of generics sometimes goes beyond things about those features at all to really change how people are thinking about the referenced categories. So when people hear a lot of generics about a category, they then tend to think that category is really coherent. So if they hear a lot of generics about girls, they tend to think that girls have many other things in common as well, even beyond the things that they've heard described generically. Often think the category is more objective and natural, and perhaps even defined by an intrinsic essence. So we sort of shorthand this by saying that when we hear social categories described with a lot of generic language, it elicits essentialist construals or a set of essentialist beliefs about that category. And this is an important thing to understand how that happens, both because it's kind of a puzzle cognitively and linguistically, and also because once people start to essentialize a social category, that often makes it the target of stereotyping and bias. So just to give you a flavor of what some of the results are that support everything that I just said, my lab has done a bunch of experimental studies looking at the consequences of describing a novel social category with generic language. So we introduced kids and adults to a made-up social group, and we show them a bunch of features about that group that we describe either generically, like Zarpies have striped hair, or various other types of controls, including a specific language control, like this Zarpie has striped hair. And then we measure, after they hear a bunch of those, their essentialist beliefs about the category Zarpies. Do they now think that that property has a biological basis, that membership and its features are inborn, that Zarpies can't do other things, all sorts of inferences like that that are consistent with an essentialist interpretation but go way beyond the content of the language that they've heard. And it is indeed the case that a relatively brief exposure to learning about a category through generics tends to lead people to essentialize it more. Those experimental effects hold across diverse sets of features, so even if all the features described with the generic are ones that you would think are more likely to be the product of teaching and not the product of biology, across conceptual domains, so at least for social categories and animal categories, hearing more generics leads to more essentialism about the referenced kinds. These effects persist for several days after exposure, at least in the case of a novel experimental setup, so it's not like a priming effect, but changes how people are thinking about the category over time, across a wide age span, and can have some immediate consequences for social behavior and evaluations. These are also not laboratory artifacts that just occur when children are in really controlled environments and hearing only one type of language about a category or another, because you can also find evidence for the relationship between generics and essentialism when we look in everyday speech. It's a really important complementary research strategy. So if you track the proportion of references to social categories that children hear from their parents or teachers, depending on the study, in relation to particular kinds, the proportion of those references that is generic, so not the proportion of like gender category labels, but the proportion of all references to gender that are in this generic, that communicate something generically, relates to more essentialism for gender, ethnicity, race, animal kinds, and for how people think about the category scientists. So this is a pervasive effect of language on how people are thinking about these categories. But exposure to generic language definitely doesn't create essentialist thought. Essentialist thought goes way beyond the content, and there's no way the language could be doing that. So we really have to ask how, and that's what the focus of what I want to talk about in the rest of my talk is. How is it that exposure to generic language leads to essentialist beliefs in children and adults? And then based on how we think about how much does it matter who is saying those generics? That's where the role about speaker knowledge comes in. Really briefly want to highlight that with my colleague Mark Ho and our postdoc Marianna Zhang, we're doing a bunch of modeling work that tries to unravel the cognitive processes that underlie how generics shapes people's essentialist beliefs. And I'm just going to mention it on a really high level that's relevant for today, which is the modeling approach that works the best, at least to explain these processes in adults, has two components. One is hierarchical Bayesian inference, which allows a learner to learn not just about the features they hear described generically, but to make hierarchical, to draw inferences at a higher level in the conceptual hierarchy or over hypothesis about the nature of the category itself. So that part is really important for getting you from hearing some particular features described generically, like Zarpies have striped hair, Zarpies love to sing, whatever, to a more general belief that Zarpies have lots of other things in common with one another as well. It increases at a higher level people's expectations that the category is homogeneous and natural. But we have to, in order to explain adult data, we have to integrate this with also pragmatics from the Rational Speech Act framework, which suggests that people are also tracking speakers' intent and making inferences about speaker intent from the speaker's choice to use a generic. That there's something about a speaker using a generic that signals to a listener that the adult thinks the category is a coherent and natural kind, and this is part of why listeners appear to adopt those beliefs themselves. And so from this, we can create two kinds of models of listeners and how they might respond to generics. One that does so more literally, so just thinking about what the content of what is said, which can still do the hierarchical Bayesian inference to get the over-hypotheses about category structure, but also another type of listener that includes pragmatic processes. And so if it is the case that in adults and in young children, the interpretation of generics, and part of why generics have this effect on thought, is because of what people think they cue about the speaker's beliefs, then it should matter a lot who is saying those generics. People who have the knowledge and the cultural standing to know if a particular social category sort of has essentialist status in a particular community, should be given a lot of weight in this kind of context, whereas someone who is saying generics about social categories but doesn't really know anything about them should not. And so that is what we wanted to test in the experiments I'm going to share with you next. So in this, we introduced, yes, please. Thank you. In this, we introduced children to, oh, I didn't see it. Okay, thanks. To a novel category, Zarpies, with a different language, where they're going to hear either generic language about Zarpies, like Zarpies are scared of ladybugs, Zarpies bounce a ball on their head, Zarpies hate ice cream, Zarpies eat flowers, or they're going to, thank you so much. Or they're going to hear specific statements about the same images. This Zarpy hates ladybugs, this Zarpy bounces a ball on her head, this Zarpy hates ice cream, this Zarpy eats flowers. But that's sort of a standard manipulation. But what we're layering on top of that is whether the speaker knows anything about Zarpies. So we tell them in one condition that there's a visitor who's new to the town, has never seen Zarpies before, or has never seen anything in the town before, and is going to walk around and just like share what they see. And so this visitor doesn't know if Zarpies are a coherent group, if they share a lot of things in common, if whether being a Zarpy is inborn. They have no knowledge about Zarpies because they're brand new to the community. And of course, which social categories are used to sort of organize society varies across different cultural contexts. And so this is a case where you would expect a person to need to have cultural standing, to know how their society is organized, to be able to use generics in a useful and strategic manner. So in that ignorant condition, we just said, in the first study, the person says, after they go around and they show they're ignorant about the town, they then say, I don't know if this is right. I heard someone here is called Zarpy. Let me go see if I can find some. They then walk around. They see a Zarpy doing one of these things and say, oh, look, I think there's a Zarpy. The Zarpy's bouncing a ball on her head. Zarpies bounce ball on their heads. So it's pretty clear from all of that, the pragmatics and the context, that the person is just like drawing that generalization based on exposure to very little evidence. And the fact that they chose to use a generic, we might think is kind of suspect, like do they really know? And then we compared that to a condition where it's an expert who's lived in the town a while and goes around and says the same stuff, but with confidence. Look, there's a Zarpy, the Zarpy's bouncing a ball on their head, Zarpies bounce a ball on their head. So we cross speaker knowledge with the linguistic form. They learned about the speakers, they heard the language by their conditions, and then we completed measures of their essentialist beliefs about Zarpies that we drew from previous work. So here's adult data, and adult data is completely consistent with the predictions that I just laid out to you. When the speaker was knowledgeable, which is the K condition, adults essentialized the category that they learned about more if they heard generic language than if they heard specific language, just like in all previous work. But with the speaker was unknowledgeable, they did not do that. So hearing generics from an unknowledgeable speaker seemed to block that effect of generics on thought. Children, however, ages 5 to 10, did not pay any attention to the speaker knowledge. They essentialized the category more from generics than from specifics, regardless of whether that speaker had cultural standing in the community. So we thought this was interesting, and we thought of two possibilities for why this might be the case in children. One was that maybe the speaker wasn't ignorant enough. Maybe by saying, I don't know if this is right, but I heard some people here are called Zarpies. Maybe that was enough for the children to think Zarpies are real, this person heard about them, and now they're just telling me things that are informative. So we made the speaker even more ignorant by saying, oh, look, there are some people wearing hats. That's interesting, they're wearing hats. I'm going to call them Zarpies. So they just, like the ignorant speaker who knows nothing about the community, knows nothing about what's going on here, just makes up the category and starts saying generics about it. So the speaker is now more ignorant. The other thing we thought is that maybe speaker effects are lost in memory. So in this first design, they heard all the features, and then they completed the dependent measures of essentialism. And so we decided to integrate them so that there wasn't a memory component where you'd have to remember facts about the speaker over time. So to do this, we did it trial by trial. They would hear a learning phrase, like in the unknowledgeable generic condition, oh, look, I think that's a Zarpy. The Zarpy doesn't like walking in the mud. Zarpies don't like walking in the mud. And then they would immediately be asked a question that's an essentialism question about Zarpies and walking in the mud. So for example, do they think they do it for some intrinsic reason, like Zarpies are born hating mud, or for some extrinsic reason, like he doesn't want to get his shoes dirty, or do they think like all Zarpies hate walking in the mud, or some might like it? So we just asked the questions right after. In adult data, it replicated the previous finding. Adults essentialize more from generics than specific statements in the knowledgeable condition, but not the unknowledgeable condition. This time, we found attention to speaker knowledge in children ages 7 and older. So children ages 7 and older essentialized more from generics than specific language when the speaker was knowledgeable, and they did not do that when the speaker was unknowledgeable. But children ages 5 to 7 still essentialize from generics more than specifics, regardless of the speaker knowledge. Even though they were told the speaker had never seen Zarpies before, in fact, the speaker made up the category of Zarpies with no knowledge about the community, and the questions were asked immediately after the statements. So going back to our processes here, this kind of suggests that children ages 7 and up are relying on both hierarchical Bayesian inference and irrational speech acts pragmatics type processes to explain why generics affect thought, but maybe younger children are being more literal listeners. They seem to not be tracking the speaker states, perhaps not thinking about these things as cues to speaker beliefs, but just treating the language as a cue to the status of the world. So this leaves a lot of open questions. As I mentioned, we changed a couple of things from study 1 to study 2. So we don't actually know in the older children why they ignored speaker knowledge in study 1 but tracked it in study 2. Could be because we reduced the memory demands. Could be because we made the speaker more ignorant. So we have to figure that out in our future work. And in younger children, I think it's super interesting that they are just learning from language regardless of who's saying it in this context, especially because we know children of this age do reason pragmatically in other contexts. So we have more work to figure out what's going on there as well. Yeah, and I'm going to leave it at that because I'm already a minute over. So thank you for listening. I want to acknowledge my colleagues, collaborators, and students on this project and the other members of the lab that have given feedback on it. Thank you.